Once upon a time, there was a very famous, infamous, weird king named Henry VIII. I think many people, even completely unfamiliar with English history, have heard of him and his marital life. In today's class, we're going to delve into the riveting saga of the turmoil associated with the time that he decided to dissolve his marriage in order to marry a second queen. We're going to discover how this intersected with the Jews of Italy and the rabbis at the time, and how people tried getting in the way of the Jewish perspective from being voiced in this particular story. We're going to read the lone surviving Hebrew letter by an Italian rabbi that was dispatched to London at this time. We'll also try to hear additional arguments that contemporary Jews were saying as they are conveyed by dispatches that were sent around by European diplomats at the time. In the British Library, there is a document that is a manuscript that is named Arundel 151. And this manuscript was penned in the year 1530. It's dated the 30th of January in 1530. And as far as I know, it's only been published one time in a French academic Jewish journal in the year 1895. So let's have a read of what this brief document says. It begins with the following words. She'alani galach echad chashuv. I've been asked by a prominent galach, a Christian theologian, Shmoi Messer Francisco Cortizo. His name is Mr. Francisco Cortizo. I don't know exactly who this person is, who this priest is, but he's posing a question. Who is he posing this question to? He's posing the question, the letter is signed by Rabbi Yaakov Rafal Feiano. Rabbi Yaakov Rafal Feiano was a Rav in Italy in the 16th century, although he did not write any Sfarim that we have, but he is mentioned in numerous sources as a Rav, as a Posek, and as a Mechaber. In fact, it is said that he wrote Chidushim or Biurim on the Tur, which have not come down to us. So his voice is speaking in this letter, and he is saying that a galach has asked him, an important galach has asked him a question. So anytime there's a galach, like the jokes of a rabbi and a priest, right? So anytime we have a galach asking a question of a rabbi, it's obviously something that's not very usual. And so therefore it piques our curiosity. What indeed is the question that he is asking Rabbi Yaakov Rafal Feiano? So what's the question? So what happens is as follows. In Parshas Kiseitze, in this week's Parsha, we have the din of Yibum. What's the din of Yibum? That when a brother, we'll call Reuven, passes away without any children, so Shimon should take the wife of Reuven. That's the mitzvah of Yibum. Now normally, for Shimon to marry Reuven's wife would be impermissible. Why is that? Because you have in Parshas Acharei Mos, where the pasuk says, Ervas Eishes Achicha Lo Segale, that a man should not have relations with the wife of his brother. Now, if they're still married, I don't need this pasuk, because if they're still married, that's a Eishes Ish. So the way we understand this pasuk is that it's referring to after their marriage. Reuven, let's say, divorced his wife. So Shimon, the brother, although she's already divorced, is not allowed to take her. Or another situation is, let's say, Reuven had children and passed away, so then again, Shimon is not allowed to take his wife. That's what this pasuk is coming to prohibit. Ervas Eishes Achicha Lo Segale. So Yibum is an interesting situation, because here it's the same person who is normally not allowed, and here it's a mitzvah for the Shimon to marry her. Again, it's a unique situation in where she has no children. No children have been born. Good. So now the question is, how are we supposed to understand the pasuk? And he asks the question in a very interesting way. It's going to take a little effort to understand what he's trying to do, but it's worth the effort because it's going to be very interesting to see where this is going. At first, it's not going to be entirely clear why he's even asking the question that he's going to ask, but as we'll move along, it's going to become clear. In fact, right now, it would be best to think of the question in a yeshivish way, like a chakida, a lamdisha type of question. He wants to know, when you're reading Parshas Achrei Mos, and you have to teach the pasuk, Ervas Eishas Achicha Lo Yisagale, or let's say you're writing not a literal translation, but a translation with biurim. So one way of doing it is to say, a sister-in-law is always off limits. No ifs and buts, always. A sister-in-law is always, the wife of your brother is always off limits. And that's how you translate this pasuk. And this pasuk includes all situations and a sister-in-law, and any situation. Then you come to Dvarim, and then in Dvarim, that's when you introduce the exception. The idea that there's a case when not only it's mutter, but it's a mitzvah, you don't get that from Achrei, you don't know that from Achrei, you only get that from later. And so if you're writing an elucidation of Parshas Achrei, you don't put that information there because it's not stemming from the pasuk only, and you'll delay it to Parshas Kisei, that's where you'll put it. That's one option. Or another option is to say, no, if you want to know the taich in Parshas Achrei of Ervas Eishas Achicha Lo Yisagale, you say like this. If they're married, obviously. If they're divorced, also it's forbidden. If the husband died without any children, with children, it's also forbidden. But the pshat in this pasuk of Ervas Eishas Achicha Lo Yisagale is not including the unique case of Yibum. And in fact, if you want to know what this pasuk here means, it means that in that case it's actually mutter and it's actually a mitzvah. And a footnote would say, see more in Parshas Kisei. That's his question, how to read it in Parshas Achrei. Now again, when you read this question, you're scratching your head. What in the world's the difference? Doesn't matter. It's not going to change the din, how you read the pasuk. The facts are still going to remain the same. And that's why I said it sounds like a little bit of like a lumdisha, obscure question. But as it's going to become clear, there was a very real reason why a galach was asking this question to Rabbi Yaakov Rafal Fayano. And it's going to become clear as we move along. So let's take a break and jump to the end of the tshuva just to see the signature. It's signed Rabbi Yaakov Rafal Fayano, Yoim Lamed of January in the year Reish Tzadik, Poi Madana. So Madana is in Italy. So that's where this exchange is happening. And it wasn't only an oral conversation. Rabbi Yaakov Rafal then put it down in writing in Madana in Italy. And he gives the date as the 30th of January in the year 1530. Reish Tzadik is the year 1530. And it's interesting, although he uses the secular month, he does not use the secular year. It could be that at this time, counting for what we call the common era counting was too much associated with Christianity for his liking, and so he wouldn't have wanted to do this. But using the secular months didn't have that connotation for him, and so therefore he felt this was okay. He's not the only one. There's a number of other Italian Rabbanim in the 16th century who I've seen shuvas where they do something very similar, Jewish year, but the secular month. So the question that we want to address today is, why is this conversation happening? Why is this galach asking this question? Why is it then put in writing? And how does this Italian conversation end up in a document in the British Library where it remains till today? So that's the driving question for today's shir. Let's continue. In the 1870s, there were a number of interesting printings of books in Great Britain, in London, in where they went back to this tkufa, to the 16th century, and the king in England at the time was Henry VIII, and they published a lot of documents that survived from that era, meaning many of Henry VIII's ambassadors would write to him all the time, and so there was a whole archive of these letters. Much of it was written in Latin. So what they did is they published it, not word for word, but they translated it into English, and they summarized it so you get the main points. And these were published in the 1870s, and so then if anyone really wants to learn about what was going on in the inner circle of Henry VIII at the time, who was the king in the 1530s in England, they were able to read these books, these volumes printed in the 1870s and gain that information. At the same time, in addition to that, they also went to other countries, the editors of these volumes, and they went, for example, to Spain. And any document in the Spanish archives where the other emperors or other kings were talking about Henry VIII or their relations with London, so then they published these as well. So I want to read a letter that comes from a number of times we're going to read letters from that were printed in these volumes. So this comes from a volume printed in 1879. It's a letter to Emperor Charles V. Who's Emperor Charles V? Emperor Charles V is known as the Holy Roman Emperor. And that's because he was the king over the Holy Roman Empire. So what's the Holy Roman Empire? Just for a quick historical background. After the fall of Rome, when Rome fell, it was a Christian country. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a number of years where you don't have a Holy Roman Emperor anymore. You don't have that ruler who was a Christian who was presiding over the entire empire. So they came up with this idea. They want to bring it back. And so they came up with this idea that they're going to nominate the most important Christian ruler in Europe, wherever he is, doesn't matter where, and they're going to call him the Holy Roman Emperor. The Kachava, and so there were different people throughout the Middle Ages who had this term. And in the 16th century, it's King Charles. He is, his primary base is Germany, Belgium, those areas, but he's ruler over many different lands, and he was one of the most powerful people in the world at the time, perhaps the most important person at the time. There's actually a famous line from Voltaire, a French philosopher in the 1700s, who then they also had the Holy Roman Empire, and he said, the Holy Roman Empire is in no way holy, not Roman, and it's not an empire. And what he meant by that is that it wasn't an empire because at that time in the 1700s, it wasn't ruling over many different states and provinces. It wasn't Roman because it had nothing to do with the city of Rome. And it wasn't holy for obvious reasons. At this time, however, in the 16th century, it definitely is an empire. Charles is reigning over many different lands. It's even Roman, and that's because in the year 1527, he actually conquered Rome, and the Pope who was living there becomes buttle to him, becomes his subject, and that's going to be important in the story as we move along. From a Jewish perspective, was it holy at this time? To the extent that there were Jewish communities that were still in Ashkenaz living in his domains, then those were Kehillas, Kedoshas, and so I guess we would say that it was holy. Okay, so we have a letter that is written by a man named Meiser Mai. Meiser Mai is Emperor Charles' ambassador to Rome, and he's writing a letter October 2nd, 1530. Same tkufa as the earlier letter that we saw before. And again, this is printed in the volume called Calendar of Letters, Dispatches, and State Papers relating to that come from Spain, volume 4, printed in London, 1879. Let's read this letter that the ambassador, Charles V's ambassador, sends from Rome. Your Majesty will be glad to hear that here this very year, among the Roman Jews, one has been compelled to marry the widow of his brother, who had died without children. This is amazing. You have an ambassador in Rome writing to the most powerful man in the world, saying, you should know, you're going to be very, very happy to hear that here in Rome, in the Kehillah over here in Rome, a case of Yibum happened. He says that it was compelled. A man was compelled to marry the widow of his brother. Again, we don't have the original documents. I don't know exactly which word was used here. These correspondence were probably written in French. So I don't know exactly. I don't think we should be medayik too much in the word compelled. I don't believe that a yibum was compelled, that a man was compelled to do a yibum. But it means he felt he had a chiyuv. That's probably what it means. Okay, anyway, the bottom line is a case of yibum happened in the year 1530, and he's reporting to Emperor Charles that you're going to be really excited to know, glad to hear that this is what happened. Imagine if the Russian ambassador writes to President Putin in Russia, you'd be glad to hear that the bakery on Lee Avenue changes hashgacha from Satmar to Kloisenberg. Like, what? This is such a bizarre thing. What's going on over here? The letter continues, and he says a thing which is not only is not prohibited, as we maintain, but is actually enjoined by Jewish law. So Yibum is not usr, it's actually mutter, as we maintain. We, the ambassador and Emperor Charles, have an opinion over here about whether Yibum is obligatory or not obligatory, mutter or not a mutter. This is definitely raises eyebrows. Okay, let's continue. There's another interesting letter that I want to call your attention to. And this was written to King Henry VIII, published at the same time in the volume that's dedicated to the letters that were written by English diplomats. It's written by a man named Richard Croke. This is a letter dated the 18th of February, 1530. Richard Croke was a teacher, a lecturer, a professor, whatever you want to call him, in Cambridge University, in the college in Cambridge. He also had a personal relationship with King Henry because he was his teacher at a certain point. And at this point, he is an envoy of King Henry in Italy. And so he's writing from Italy to King Henry, and he writes as follows. He says, I'm sending to you a letter by some Christian theologian, and I'm sending this to you with some writings by learned Hebrews, by learned Jews, in your favor. And what are these letters saying? That the Levitical law has always been holy and intact, and never abolished nor weakened. That the din in Vayikra, I'm already going to inform you that this is referring to the pasuk of the Isser to have relations with a sister-in-law. That's always been holy, intact, never abolished nor weakened. On the other hand, the law of Deuteronomy was never observed. The law of Deuteronomy, meaning the dinim of Yibum, hasn't been observed even by the Jews themselves after the destruction of Jerusalem. So whereas Charles' ambassador is saying, you're going to be pumped up to know that Yibum still happens, and we hold that it should happen, and indeed it is happening, Richard Croke, Henry's agent in Rome, says that he is sending ksavim, writings from the Jews who are saying that they don't do, from the time of the Churban, they don't do Yibum anymore. So obviously that's a contradiction. Does Yibum happen or does it not happen? And that's a contradiction that we will resolve later on. But the bottom line is, here again we see a very, very odd thing. Why would King Henry VIII be curious to know about how Jews understand whether they do Yibum or they don't do Yibum? All three of these letters, of which we read a few lines of each, the common denominator is that they're all discussing the mitzvah of this week's Parashas Kiseitze about Yibum. And they all raise that question, why in the world are these conversations happening? Why are these correspondences happening? What is going on over here? Okay, so in order to understand this, we need to remind ourselves and of our history class where we learned about world history in the 16th century. And let's talk about this for a few minutes. At the turn of the 16th century, in the year 1500, the King of England's name was Henry VII. And he was the king till the year 1509. And his queen, her name was Elizabeth, and they had two male children. The older male child's name was Arthur, and the younger male child's name was Henry VIII. Henry VIII, the recipient of the letter that we just read. Henry VIII was going to become the king after his father did. After his father died, he followed Henry VII. Okay, now when you have children, a big sugya that occupies everyone's minds and hearts is shidduchim. Who are these kids going to marry? And shidduchim is very much about building alliances with other important monarchs. And who was the most important monarch in the early 1500s? It's none other than the famous Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain. At this time, they're at the height of their power. They have conquered the last Islamic stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, Granada. They had sent Columbus to discover America, and he had indeed by this time discovered America, so they are ahead of the curve in terms of the discovery in the New World. And they also have just expelled their Jews and collected all of their debts, and so they're really flying high. And so when Henry VII wants to make a shidduch for his son Arthur, he turns his eyes toward the Spanish crown, to Ferdinand and Isabella, and they send the best shadchanim, otherwise known as ambassadors, to go work out a shidduch. And that's because Ferdinand and Isabella had a female child by the name of Catherine. And indeed, this shidduch was realized. And Arthur was betrothed to Catherine and eventually married in the year 1501. Now, the problem is that in the year 1501, Arthur was only 15 years old. And the way Catholic marriages were supposed to work is you were supposed to be at a minimum of 16 years old. In addition, the marriage happened when they were 15. The betrothal happened even earlier, and so this was a problem from a Catholic perspective. So what did they do? They turned to the Pope, and they asked the Pope for a dispensation. This is going to be important because the idea of turning to the Pope to skirt the rules is going to be something that comes up again and again in this story. And indeed, the Pope says, no problem, I give my heter that they couldn't get married. And so the shidduch happens, in ve'agefen, be'in ve'agefen. Arthur and Catherine are married in the year 1501. However, just a few months after their marriage, Arthur dies. And Arthur dies, we're left with a big problem. Because so much was at stake in this marriage for both sides. It's building an alliance, money exchanged hands, they promised each other certain things, and for all of that to fall apart now because the marriage has been dissolved because Arthur has died, that would be a real shame. And so there was this attempt to try to keep the marriage going. How would you keep this marriage and alliance going? So the idea was, there's a younger brother. The younger brother, his name is Henry, and if he would just marry Catherine, so then that would solve all of the problems and the alliance could stay as is. And there was just one problem. The problem is that in Catholic doctrine, this is not a normal thing to do for a brother to marry a sister-in-law. In fact, it was normally considered to be forbidden. And the idea of yibum was not something that was normally practiced. And so therefore, they turned to the Pope again to get a dispensation, to say, dear Pope, please allow Henry to marry Catherine, his sister-in-law. And the Pope says, I hereby declare that it is mutter and it is okay for him to do it. And so essentially, without using those words, Henry was miyabim Catherine. And they get married in the year 1509. So that's a good 8 or so years after Arthur had passed away. Anyway, Henry and Catherine are married and everything is nice and dandy. Henry lives, he doesn't die. And Catherine also lives. The problem, however, is their fertility. And that is that the Catherine gives birth to a girl, Mary, in the year 1516. But other than that, she's having a number of stillbirths, a few children who are born but die very soon or within a few days of their birth. And the bottom line is that as we move into the 1520s, there is no male heir. And Henry VIII wants a male heir because that is the way passing down the throne is something that a monarch always wants, it should stay within the family, and stay within the family at that time meant through a male heir, and that's what he wanted, and he wasn't having that. And at the same time, he also was starting to get involved with other women, and there was another woman who caught his attention, whose name was Anne Boleyn. And basically, he wanted to marry her. So you would say, okay, just divorce your wife, Catherine, and move on. Doesn't work that way. In Catholic theology or practice or law or custom, divorce is not allowed. And so that's not going to work. He can't divorce her. Catherine did not want to be divorced, which, by the way, even from a Jewish perspective, an halachic perspective, when a man wants to divorce his wife, but the wife refuses to accept the get, so from the time of King Henry VIII, so that causes all types of complications that makes things very, very difficult. But from their side of the story, divorce bichlal is not an option. There is no divorce. And so what is he supposed to do? And this is where he reaches his problem. And this is known in history as Henry's Great Matter. What is he going to deal? How is he going to deal with this problem? So he came up with the idea that he wants to have his marriage annulled. and this does exist in Catholic thinking, the idea that although a divorce is not possible, it is possible to use Talmudic language to be mevatel the kedushin lemafreya, to say that it should never have happened for whatever reason, to come up with a reason why the marriage was entered into under false premises, and so therefore we could be mevatel the kedushin. That does exist, and it needs to be granted by a high church authority. And for a monarch, that would have meant turning again to the Pope. And so now they turn to the Pope for the third time, Henry does, and says he'd like a papal dispensation, or in other words, to have an annulment of his marriage, to say that the marriage with Catherine wasn't kosher. On what grounds wasn't it kosher? Because she was his sister-in-law. And according to Leviticus, a person is not allowed to marry their sister-in-law, and this has bothered him. And he thinks it was wrong that he married her, and so therefore he wants the marriage annulled so that he will then be able to marry the woman of his desire, Anne Boleyn. He was obviously expecting a very quick response from Rome. No problem, you can go ahead with this papal dispensation. Papal dispensation, a marriage annulments have been given to other rulers in prior years, and so he was expecting that he would get one as well. But that's not what he got. Instead, he got was, we need to see, we need to look. It's nishtazai pashut. We have to set up a commission. We need to hear from both sides. Catherine doesn't want the marriage annulled, so we need to hear what she has to say. We're going to send shluchim. We're going to make a conference, etc., etc. And so suddenly he realized that this was not going to be a pashta maisa. Why wasn't it a pashta maisa? Or in other words, why didn't the Pope Taka give him his this marriage annulment? So the reason is as follows. At least historians assume that this is the reason, and it makes a lot of sense. Catherine, who did not want the marriage annulled, had a sister. That sister's name was Joanna. Joanna and Catherine were both daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella. Joanna married into the Habsburg family, the ruling family in Germany. In other words, the Holy Roman Empire. And they had a son named Charles V, a name that you're already familiar with, who's involved in this story. And now you know why he's involved in the story. Catherine is his aunt. And if Catherine doesn't want the marriage annulled, Charles, her nephew, doesn't want the marriage annulled either. And remember, Charles V in 1527 conquers Rome, and the Pope now has to take under consideration what Charles V wants. And Charles V does not want this marriage annulled, and that is probably why the Pope is not able to do what Henry VIII wants to do, and this is the reason for our problem. And now we could understand a little bit of why Charles V is interested in this story of Yibum, and Henry. They're interested in this, as we're soon going to see, at greater length. So the bottom line is that Henry wants something. It's not coming easy for him, and so he needs to do something about it. And so he comes up with this idea that they are going to put pressure on the Pope, and the pressure on the Pope is going to be to bring so much evidence that he was not allowed to marry Catherine. A ton of overwhelming evidence. And if he comes with reams of paper establishing that point, then the Pope is not going to have a choice, and the Pope is going to have to grant an annulment to his marriage. And so they turn to many sources. Christian sources, contemporary Christian sources, older Christian sources, doing a lot of research, trying to find all the arguments in the world of why that prior dispensation allowing him to marry his sister-in-law should have never been granted and was wrong, and so therefore his marriage was no good, and so therefore the marriage should be annulled. And part of this larger research project included Jews. Someone came up with the idea that they should ask Jews what they think about this issue. Maybe by hearing what the Jews have to say, we'll be able to walk away with another piece of evidence to place at the Pope's door that will show that this marriage should have never happened because he should not have married his sister-in-law. And for that reason, Richard Croke, the name we saw before, Henry's teacher, the lecturer at Cambridge, is sent to England. And he's on this shlichus, and he is speaking to a number of Jews about this question. So let's get a little bit of a feel for what was Croke's mission. What was he trying to do? What was he looking for? Remember, in London at this time, there are no Jews. Jews were expelled from London in the year 1290. They did not return until the mid-17th century. So at this time, mid-16th century, there are no Jews there. So he's going to Italy to meet Jews, but let's see what are the types of things he's interested in hearing from them. So we get the answer to this question from another letter. This one is written by Richard Croke to the English ambassador at Rome. The English ambassador at Rome's name was Girolamo Genucci. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Henry's ambassador in Rome. And Croke writes to him a letter dated March 26, 1530, and it's again published in these same volumes. And he writes as follows, and what's important about this letter is here we get into the mind of Croke to try to see what type of information he is interested in getting from Jews. The letter reads, I will give a few gold pieces to Hebrews who have promised to write in proof of the following points. Okay, so we get very clear. He's looking for written documents that demonstrate the following 4 points, any of the following 4 points. Now the truth is, we already saw one of the points that he's interested in because I already showed you an earlier letter that he says, I have a document here that says we don't do Yibum anymore today. So really that's one thing he was interested in. The idea that Yibum once existed by Jews but no longer exists, that's one piece of data he was interested in, and that he already sent writings, which we don't know, those writings haven't survived, but he has sent such writings to London. In addition to that point, there's another 4 points that are part of his research project that he talks about in this letter over here. Number 1, that the law in Deuteronomy relates only to inheritance and to the case of Tzalafchad in the last of Numbers. What does this mean? A major chiddush that he's trying to introduce over here. When in Parshas Kiseitse it says that there's a Yibum, a Maisa of Yibum, don't read it the way you think you should be reading it, because we never want a brother marrying the wife of his brother. That should never happen. A brother means metaphoric. So what is the meaning? So we have the Maisa in the end of Parshas Maseh, where Bnei Tzalafchad inherited their father's property. So then there was a worry. What was the worry? That if they're going to marry men of other Shvatim, that property is going to transfer to other Shvatim, and so this wasn't fair to their Shevet. So what does Moshe Rabbeinu say in the end of Parshas Maseh? That the Taina is a right Taina, and so therefore the women should only marry men from their own Shevet. And this was the way things were, at least in that generation. This was the rule for women who inherited property, so that we ensure that this way property doesn't transfer from one Shevet to another Shevet. So what Croke was trying to get people to write was that in Sefer Dvarim, when it speaks about Yibum, this is what it's saying. A man dies. He has property. He has no children. Who inherits the property? The wife inherits the property. This is the way Croke wanted to understand the psukim. Now if she's going to marry a new man, a man from a different shevet, all that property gets schlepped to another shevet. We don't want that. And so therefore, it shouldn't be to a man from another shevet. A brother, not a literal brother, a metaphoric brother should marry this woman, and then the property stays within the shevet. This is the chiddush of how he wanted to teach Parshas Kiseitse. In other words, say there's no such a thing as a brother marrying an actual Yavama, a sister-in-law, no such a thing. And by this point in the Shir, we know very well why he wanted that type of thing, because he wanted to say that Henry should have never married Catherine. And again, Parshas Kiseitse, Yibum, it doesn't mean a brother. It means someone from the same Shevet, in order to ensure that the deceased property remains within the Shevet. He's looking for Jews who are willing to write this. Will he find Jews who are true to Torah who would write this type of thing? Absolutely not, because this is false. Okay, that's one point. The next point, that the marriage of Tamar with the sons of Yehuda were not consummated. Let's go back to Parshas Vayeshev, because we have there a shtickle maisa about Yibum. Because the son of Yehuda passes away, and what does Yehuda do? Tamar, the wife, is given to the second brother. That sounds like Yibum. Remember, he wants to say Yibum shouldn't be allowed. But here you have Mamish HaMaisa and Parshas Vayeshev where Yibum is happening. Oh, don't worry, it's not a problem. Why? Because in that story, when the first son passed away, he never consummated his marriage. And because he never consummated his marriage, therefore was mutter to the second brother. This is how he wants to understand the Maisa and Parshas Vayeshev. Will he find someone who's true to halacha that would write such a thing. So whether or not the marriage was actually consummated, that I don't know if our sources talk specifically to that particular issue. But that Yibum is limited to cases, in other words, that Yibum is limited to cases where where the marriage was not consummated, that obviously is incorrect. But this is what he's looking for, and we know why he's looking for that. Let's continue. The next point he's looking for, that the Levitical law is a law of nature and always enforced, being imposed on all, though Devarim was only imposed on the Jews. What does he want to say here? He wants to say that the pasuk of Parashas Achrei Mos, that's binding on everyone. Devarim is only for Jews. And by the way, this makes it very, very clear if you go back to Rabbi Yaakov Rafal and the question he was being asked. Remember, what was the question he was being asked? He wanted to know how to touch the pasuk in Vayikra. It wasn't so clear to us before. What's the difference? What's a nafkamina? At the end of the day, the Torah is one Torah, and you walk away with the idea that sister-in-laws are off limit, except for in a case of Yibum, right? So there is no difference. But here you see, because he wants to argue that Parshas Kiseitse is only talking to a Jew. Yibum's only talking to a Jew. Parshas Achrei, that's talking to everyone. That's talking to non-Jews as well. And so, if it is the case that Achrei you read as banning all sisters-in-law, so then the heter of Kiseit say, oh, that's only for a Yid. So a guy would never be allowed to marry a sister-in-law, even in a case where there are no children. So this is what he's trying to say, that Vayikra is on all people, whereas Kiseitse is only on Jews. Is it true that Yibum is not a din for Bnei Noach? We'll come back to that later at the end of this year, Be'ezras Hashem. And finally, the last thing he's looking for is that Deuteronomy does not hold good where a Levitical prohibition opposes it. This is a statement that basically says that Dvarim, Parshas Kiseitse, Yibum can't get in the way of what you learned in Achrei. So if you learned in Achrei sisters-in-law are not to be touched, then Dvarim cannot oppose that. And you're going to have to figure out a way of explaining Dvarim in a way that doesn't get in the way of Parshas Achrei Mos. So for example, say it's only talking Yibum only if the first brother didn't consummate his marriage, only then Lamashal. Or to say that it's talking about not a literal brother, but it's talking about someone from the Shevet, etc. That's okay. But this is another type of point that he's looking for. It becomes very obvious what he's trying to do over here. We understand, and this is what he's doing. He's going around to different Jews and rabbis, interviewing them, trying to get this information. In another letter, he writes that he's not making clear to people why he's asking. So in other words, an average rabbi would not have been told that there's a Maisa in England with King Henry and Catherine, and there's this problem. So they must have actually been very curious. Why is a non-Jew coming to ask me this particular question? And perhaps it wasn't, I'm sure they asked, why are you asking? And they tried to probe. How much information was given to them is not entirely clear. All right, so with all of that background, now let's come back to that question. Where Rabbi Yaakov Rafal was asked this question by the priest named Francisco Cortizo, who I guess we should assume was a shliach of Richard Croke. And let's see what he answers. How does he answer this question? And what's special about this is the only, although there's a few references, I'm sending you Hebrew writings, this is the only Hebrew writing that survives to this day. And what we're going to find is, interestingly, that Rabbi Yaakov Rafal begins his tshuva by addressing a completely different matter that wasn't even asked of him. So let's have a look at that. So he begins as follows by quoting a Gemara in Chulin. Before we read the Gemara in Chulin, just want to clarify that I'll just summarize. He opens up his tshuva where he's basically saying, I want to tell you one point. And that point is that every single mitzvah in the Torah, from beginning to the end, is all nitan l'Moshe Sinai and has the same sanctity and has the same value. Now remember, he was not being asked that question. He was being asked the question of, how do you understand, let's say I want to ignore Devarim, how do I understand Vayikra? That's the question he was being asked, but he understood what was happening over here, and he decided to give information that he wasn't being asked. You want to relegate Dvarim to being less important in one way or another? It seems like he felt that there was a plan over here to say, Vayikra I need to take seriously, Dvarim I don't have to take so seriously. Because maybe it begins with the words, Eila Dvarim Asher Diber Moshe, so maybe it's less holy, it's less sanctified for whatever reason. And seeing that was the drift where they were going, he says, the first thing I'm going to tell you, even though it wasn't the question you asked, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that all of Torah and every single mitzvah has the same degree of sanctity, or it's all given from Sinai. And how does he develop the point? He develops the point through the mitzvah of Gid Hanasha. Because there's a discussion in the Mishnah in Chulin whether an animal that is tameh, a non-kosher animal, if a person eats it, let's say they eat the Gid Hanasha of a non-kosher animal, are they over just because it's not kosher, or also over the lav of Gid Hanasha? So the Chachamim say, only not kosher. You're not over mishum gid hanasha. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'm going to bring a raya that you are over mishum gid hanasha even in a non-kosher animal. Because you have the din of gid hanasha is in Parshas Vayishlach, which he assumes therefore means that from then, the Bnei Yaakov were careful about avoiding the gid hanasha. In what animal? There was no kosher then. Kosher is Matan Torah. So they're theoretically eating all different types of animals, but they're still careful about Gid Hanasha. So doesn't that mean that Gid Hanasha is a law for Behemoths Tmeyos together with Behemoths Tahiris? This is what Rabbi Yehuda says. So the Chachamim respond back in the Mishnah and say, no. Don't think that the observance of Gid Hanasha began then. It didn't begin then. B'Sinai Namar. The tzivoy, the commandment of Gid Hanasha was given B'Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu. Elo shenichtav, when it was written into the Torah, as nichtav b'mkaimai, and the Mefarshim explains so that you would know the tam. So in order that you should understand why it is that we have this mitzvah, or one of the reasons why we have this mitzvah, so therefore it's written into Parshas Vayishlach. But the origins of this mitzvah is from Sinai. This is what he says. And then he says, I want to tell you a kal v'chomer. Madach, something that appears to be before Ma'an Torah. Afal pikein, we say it comes from Sinai. Alachas kama v'kama. The areas later in the Torah, all of these sivuyim that Moshe Rabbeinu presented to Am Yisrael in Sefer Devarim, including the mitzvah of Yibum, he heard these all at Sinai, and so they therefore have the same level of sanctity. So then you're going to ask a question. He addresses this and says, you're going to say, then why not in Parshas Acharei throw in a few psukim right there and then? Wouldn't it make so much sense? You're telling me sisters-in-law are not kosher. Okay. The Seder. So right then and there say, V'haya, that if there's a case of Yibum, right? Why don't you insert that there? Why is it waiting all the way to Dvarim? So he says, listen, when it comes to the placement of Inyanim in Torah, this is a deep subject, this is complicated stuff. I'll give you a little taste of Hasbara of why something like this could have happened. And that is, there's this whole concept of smuchin. And that is, do we analyze the placement of a text in the Torah that it's adjacent to something specific, and then say that as a result of that we're going to derive something specific. So there are chachamim who say we're doirish smuchin and chala Torah kula. However, the Rabbi Yehuda says that we're not doirish smuchin and chala Torah kula. He brings from the Gemara in Yavamis that we're only doirish smuchin in Sefer Devarim. This is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. I'll come back to explain this distinction perhaps in a second. So he says that could be one reason why you would want to put something in Dvarim. Because if you want to be doirish smuchin and you want it to be doirish smuchin l'kuli alma, that everyone should derive the fact that it's adjacent to something else, so then it has to be a Mishnah Torah. And in fact, this is not just a theory, it's a real thing. Because there is in fact laws that are derived from the smuchin, from the passage that it says before in the Torah, in Parshas Kiseitze, right before Yibum, talks about another din, and we do actually, in fact, derive something from there. The details don't need to concern us right now. And so that could be one reason. But he says it's just an example, and there could be many other reasons why we would have the placement of a certain text in a certain way. But the bottom line is that Zeh Pashut, he concludes this section of the Tshuva, says, V'zeh Pashut, v'ein sarech harichis, that every single mitzvah here is Sinai. In other words, he's saying, I don't know exactly what you plan on going with the question that you asked me, but I know enough to basically say you're trying to cancel Dvarim, you're trying to cancel Kiseitze, you're trying to cancel Yibum and say that it's not so relevant. And so therefore, the first thing I need to tell you, even though this is not what you asked, is that it doesn't work like that. It's one Torah. All of the commandments are from Sinai. Now just a moment about this smuchin. Why is it the case that you would have Rabbi Yehuda say that he's not doirish smuchin, he's not going to learn from the adjacent passages, deriving something from why they're placed next to each other in Chala Torah Kula and the entire Torah, but he is willing to do that for Sefer Dvarim? What is the svara? What is happening over here? So let's take a minute. This is a small parenthesis. The MS is that there's a passage in Gemara Megillah that says that Sefer Dvarim is Moshe mipi atzmai. Now, that almost sounds okay. Moshe mipi atzmai. Here, Moshe is saying things in his own voice that has nothing to do with God, nothing to do with Sinai. That's how this Francisco, if he would have known this Gemara, would have ran with that to the bank. But it's nicht azay pashut. Because first of all, if you look at the Gemara there, you'll see that it's actually talking about a very narrow passage. It's talking about the klalos and Parshas Kisavai. It's not talking about the entirety of Sefer Devarim. And that's why the parshas of the klalos of Parshas Kisavai are less severe. They're less scary, so to speak, compared to the ones in Bechukaisai, because they're Moshe mipi atzmai. Now the emes is, there are sources in Kabbalah that say that Moshe mipi atzmai said the entire Sefer Dvarim. But that's what Kabbalah says, so if you want to take that seriously, you also have to listen to the Kabbalistic explanation of what that means. And Kabbalah explains that the meaning of that is, not that it originated in Moshe mipi atzmai, it all originated in Sinai, exactly as Rabbi Yaakov Rafal is saying. But it was nislabesh, it was vested in Moshe's mind in such a way where it fully integrated with him and came part of him, came one with him, as if he's speaking his own words. Meaning there's two ways a divine message could filter through Moshe Rabbeinu. One is, it can come, it's so divine, it's so lofty, that it transcends Moshe's mind. He's speaking it, he's telling it to you, but he doesn't feel that he grasps it fully. And that's Bereshis through Bamidbar is in that way. Sefer Dvarim, the Kabbalistic sources tell us, is Moshe mipi atzmai amram. What that means is that the divine ideas came down to such a level where Moshe Rabbeinu was able to comprehend it. Once you understand it in that way, you can understand why Rabbi Yehuda, this is an explanation for the Rebbe, why Rabbi Yehuda would say that Kol HaTorah Kula, I'm not doiris smuchin. You can't be doiris smuchin. You think we're going to be able to figure out why text A is next to text B in an area in Torah that just went through Moshe Rabbeinu in a way that he didn't even grasp it? There's no way we're going to figure out. Of course there's a reason, but we're not going to figure it out, so we shouldn't even attempt. But when it comes to Dvarim is nislabish and the saga of Moshe Rabbeinu, and so therefore by extension that means we have more of an entry point to this text. So therefore here we have the ability to figure out why one text is adjacent to the other text. This is a parenthesis just to give a little bit of an explanation of what is the meaning of why we're doiris smuchin specifically and more proudly when it comes to Sefer Dvarim relative to the rest of the Sefer. But anyway, back to our tshuva in Sefer Dvarim as opposed to the rest of the Torah. But anyway, back to our tshuva. As of now, Rabbi Yaakov Rafal just established that you are not going to be able to just wash away the dinim of Yibum. They are Sinai no less than anything else. Okay, but he still didn't answer the question. The question was, but how, when I come to the pasuk in Parshas Acharei, and I want to write again, not a literal translation, but I want to say everything this pasuk includes, do I include the Yibum exception into this pasuk or not? That is the question. He says, okay, now I'll answer that. And he says as follows. We, when it comes to the text of the Torah, in addition to the text of the Torah, we also have the oral tradition. And the oral tradition tells us how to understand each and every pasuk. And the answer to your question is absolutely. That when it comes to the pasuk in Acharei Mos, and it says that one shouldn't have relations with a sister-in-law, it has a rule book, and that rule book is applicable to this pasuk. And part of that rule book is, if, however, the brother died without children, then there's no isser. In fact, there is a mitzvah of yibum, and yes, that's how you read this specific pasuk. And he comes and he gives an example, another example from Parshas Kiseitze, where it talks about a woman who committed adultery, for which there is a death sentence. And he brings from the Gemara, and where the Messiah limits this in terms of, it has to be a Naira Moirasa, is someone she had her Kiddushin with a specific man. And then you had two witnesses who observed that after the Kiddushin, Not before the Kedushin. After the Kedushin, before the Nisuyin, that's when she had the affair in a way that it was completely beratzen, and there are two witnesses, and there was Hasra. Then the din applies. He says, sometimes you read a pasuk and it's like, oh, you think it means one thing. And but then you find out that there's actually some important qualifications in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Same thing. It sounds like sister-in-law is always off limits, and it turns out that there's important qualifications. But you read it into this pasuk. It's the Kabbalah of this pasuk. It's not information that comes from later on. How much more so, he says, when it comes to this issue, because here we have Parshas Vayeshev, and we have their Yibum. So how much more so it makes so much sense to say that when you come to Parshas Acharei Mos, you should read it in a way that it includes the Yibum exception. This is the answer that he gives. Now obviously, if the people there understood what he wrote, there's no way they would have sent this to London, because London did not want to hear this. London had an interest in relegating Dvarim to the back burner, which he negated in the first part of his tshuva, and they also had an interest in trying to say that Acharei Mos banned Yibum, and it only kind of came mutter because of Parshas Kiseitze. Well, he negated that as well and told us that Parshas Acharei Mos is, you read the pasuk with the Halach L'Moshe Messinai Kabbalah telling us that Yibum is on the table. And this is not something they were interested in hearing, but presumably they didn't understand his answer. And you also have to assume that they spoke orally before he wrote his tshuva. So again, not entirely clear what happened, but it ends up in London. It's not helpful. And so therefore we should assume that nothing really came of this particular document. And so that's going to bring us to the next part in the story, and where, okay, it's not Rabbi Yaakov Rafal that's going to be helpful, so we need to find others. And indeed, they did look to others, and there are other names that are important to this story. The problem is that very often we don't hear from these other rabbis that they're talking to, we don't really hear any content of what the arguments are going to be. There's one other person who we do hear some content, we do hear some Torah arguments, though not directly, indirectly, so we are going to turn to that momentarily. I just want to do another parenthesis here and to say that the truth is that if you learn in the Rishonim, the question that this Christian theologian asked was not a bad question at all. He obviously is weaponizing it and trying to use it in a negative way, especially if you're trying to be doichik, to push away the mitzvah of Yibum. So understood that he's taking this in the wrong direction. But actually the question is a very, very fair question, and the MS is that there's a tzad for each side in the Rishonim. You have Tosfos and the Rashba and Maseches Yevamis, when they talk about Yibum, which is relations with a sister-in-law that is normally not permitted, they understand it in the context of aseh doicha lois aseh. Now again, this is a big sugya, but for our purposes, enough to say they read Acharei Mos as a lois aseh. It's including all sisters-in-law. And then when you come to Dvarim, you learn that there's an aseh, and in this case, the aseh can push off the lois aseh. So from their perspective, the rabbi's answer was not the correct answer. On the other hand, you have other Rishonim who reject this view, the Ramban, the Yad Ramah, and their commentaries on Ramban is in a Sefer Teres Adam. They actually learned that it's nishtazai, and they actually use language very similar to what Yaakov Rafal did, and know that there never is a moment, there never is a pasuk that is banning a yavam. It's always an exception baked in from the beginning. So it happens to be that it's a valid machlokas to have within Torah, but that's only if your goal isn't to then erase all of the passage of Yibum and to say it's inapplicable and all of that. So that is an interesting side note, but again, a larger discussion, and it doesn't need to concern us. All right, so Rabbi Yaakov Rafal's document isn't helpful. The only other strong Jewish voice that we hear is what we're going to engage in the following. So there's a man by the name of Meiser Mai. Meiser Mai is the ambassador of Emperor Charles. I believe he was the one earlier who wrote about, you're going to be happy to know about the Yibum that happened in Rome. So Meiser Mai writes the following letter to Emperor Charles. And let's remember, he does not want the marriage annulment to take place. He wants his aunt Catherine to remain married to Henry. So the letter is dated November 28, 1530, and Mai writes the following to Emperor Charles. Among those who have given their opinions here, because Mai is in Italy, in favor of the king, is a converted Jew, who now goes by the name of Marco Gabriello. So we have a Jew here, who it seems converted to Christianity. The circumstances are not entirely clear, but he converted to Christianity. And he is saying opinions that are beneficial to the king. His name here is given as Marco Gabriello, and other places his name is given as Marco Raphael, to whom the King of England has offered as much money as he may ask, having instructed his ambassadors to treat with him and have him sent to England. Wow. So King Charles is being notified that there is this Marco Raphael in Italy who is being given money. He's saying stuff the king wants, and now the king wants him brought in. Don't just send me Yiksavim. I want you to come to England, and I want to hear what you have to say. It's important to note here that although this Jew converted, unfortunately, to Christianity, he's being asked here for his opinion and his expertise in Yiddishkeit and Torah and in Halacha, not for Christian points of view that they had from elsewhere. So now, why is he writing this to Emperor Charles? Because he wants to keep him updated about everything. But listen to what he writes now. Considering it to be for your majesty's interest to prevent this man's journey to England. You, Charles, don't want him to get to England. I have taken the precaution of writing to Scalenga at Asti, that's a place in northern Italy, giving his signalment, giving his facial features, describing what this Marco looks like, that he may be arrested if passing through that country. You hear what's going on over here? You have the most powerful person in the world being given a memo by his ambassador that there is a Jew who converted to Christianity that is on the way to London, and you have an interest in stopping him, so I'm sending wanted signs to all of our agents that he should be arrested. Rodrigo Nino has been instructed to set spies upon him and have him followed to Trent, to Milan, to Asti, whichever route he may take. Wow, so there's a lot of effort in stopping this Marco from getting into London. Well, it didn't work. And here we pick up the story from London, where there's a dispatch sent to King Charles from a man by the name of Eustace Chapois. Chapois was the ambassador to London from Charles, and so he writes the following. This is dated January 31st, 1531. The Jew whom this king sent for, notwithstanding all the precautions taken by Messer Mai. So I know about the whole CIA operation that we tried doing in order to stop him from coming over. Well, it didn't work. We tried preventing his passage, but he arrived here in London 6 days ago. He has already seen the king twice and been very well received. Wow, so they're really happy to have this person who's going to come and share with them Torah views that they think are going to be helpful for the case for marriage annulment that, again, they're going to bring to the Pope's door and is going to force him to give an annulment for the marriage. All right, what does this Jew say when he comes to the king? What is the heter? And here we hear of his heter for marriage annulment. Well, actually, more precisely, it's not marriage annulment. Let's actually tune in and listen to what's being said. The only thing is, we need to obviously be aware. We're not hearing Marco's voice. We're hearing Eustace Chapois' voice, and Chapois himself didn't hear. He wasn't in the room when Marco was speaking, so it's from a Kli Shlishi, and so we can never really be sure exactly what is being said. But let's try to work with the text that we have and try to see if we can understand what Marco was saying. I am told that his opinion is that the queen's marriage ought not to be disputed or dissolved. So Marco is saying you cannot annul this marriage. Okay, so then how is he helpful for the king? But nevertheless, that the king may and can very well take another wife conjointly with his first. You can marry a second wife. What's the pshat? So he continues in the letter. I hear that the pith, meaning the point of the Jew's argument, is that although the king's marriage with the widow of his brother was a true and legitimate act, it was good that he married Catherine, al pi Torah, the posterity issuing from such a union is ascribed to the first husband. Here is the chiddush. Children, like Mary was actually born from their wedding, from their marriage. Mary is not Henry VIII's daughter. Mary is Arthur's daughter. Because, we'll see the psukim in a moment, Vayeda Einon ki lo ye'azara. The Yavam knew that the child's not going to be his. He's having the child for his brother. Okay, so why is that relevant? So the Chapois continues telling us what Marco was saying. And as it would be unreasonable that in order to preserve the name and race of the deceased, the survivor should be prevented from having posterity of his own and bearing his own name, so therefore law allows him to take another wife. What's he saying? He's saying that because the child that you're going to have with Catherine, Yavam and Yavama, is not your child, but is Yakum al Shem, Echav Hameitz, goes for the brother. So it turns out that you have a problem. You need to have your own children. Or, perhaps in a different way of saying it, you need to do your mitzvah, pruravu, and this child doesn't count for your mitzvah. And so therefore, polygamy is mutter for you. Don't annul your marriage, just take this new wife as a second just take a second wife, and then you have two queens, or one is going to be designated the queen. But the main thing is you'll have a legitimate second wife, and hopefully you'll have a male heir from him. This is what Marco is said to have told King Henry. Now, what's interesting is, remember, he's talking from a Jewish perspective. From a Jewish perspective, he could have just said, you could marry a second wife because polygamy is not asar al pi Torah. But it seems Marco doesn't want to say that. So I guess Marco's shitta was the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, which bans polygamy, is in effect. And so you can't just come and say, oh, from a Jewish perspective, you could take a second wife. He had to come up with a heter and a reason that despite Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, there is the ability to take another wife for the reason that he just gave. Now, when you're reading this, you may say, well, does this hold any water? So I want to explain why I think, where I think he's coming from, where Marco is coming from, and what he's trying to do. Again, clearly he's trying to remain within the contours of Jewish law, not only the contours of Jewish law, like Min HaTorah, but down to his day, where there was a Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, which again is why he didn't just say marry a second wife, but he comes up with a heter of why in this case, a unique case, why it's mutter to marry a second wife. So let's look at some of the sources that address the issue of Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, when it does apply and when it doesn't apply. And then I want to show you what I think Marco was trying to say over here. So you have in Shulchan Aruch Even Ezer, where it summarizes a major machlokes that existed amongst the Rishonim who accepted Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. So it says as follows. Rabbeinu Gershom hechrim ala noise al ishtoi. Rabbeinu Gershom says polygamy is not allowed. Says Mechaber Avol biyavama loy hechrim. What does this mean? This means as follows. Let's say there's a yid who's married to his wife and they have children, happily married. Okay, polygamy is not allowed. But then he has a brother who dies without children, so now he has a chiyuv yavama. So should he take the yavama? So on the one hand you say Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. You're not allowed to. On the other hand, what do you mean? You have a mitzvah min HaTorah to do yibum. So the question is, do we do yibum in this case? Or another way of framing the question is, does the ban of Rabbeinu Gershom stand in the way of a mitzvah as well? Says the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch, it does not stand in the way of a mitzvah. And the Ramah expands and gives another example. Let's say a man is married to a wife and it's 10 years and they didn't bear any children. So now the question is, you have a mitzvah of pruravu. Can I take a second wife in order to do the mitzvah of pruravu? So this logic, no, there is no problem. Because Rabbeinu Gershom made a ban, in a chanami, but it's not a ban that gets in the way of doing a mitzvah. Here you have a mitzvah of pruravu, which is not being fulfilled with the first wife, so go ahead and marry a second wife. This is one shitta amongst the Rishonim. Again, you have some who never accepted Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, the Sfardim. We're not talking about them. We're talking about within the school of those who accepted Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, they did so in a limited way where it doesn't apply in a case of a mitzvah. Then the Ramah continues and says, Amnam yesh cholkim. There are those who disagree. V'sfira lahem, b'cheir and Rabbeinu Gershom noyeg afilu b'makem mitzvah, v'afilu b'makem yibum, v'tzarich lachloitz. There are others who hold that Rabbeinu Gershom is a complete ban. There's no such a thing as marrying a second wife, even if it's yibum, even if it's mitzvah, there's no such a thing. If a yibum comes up, you just do chalitza. You're not allowed to take the second wife. So, what's happening here? Marco is basically doing as follows. We accept the ban of Rabbeinu Gershom. After all, Henry, you're Ashkenazi, and so we have to work within those rules. But there's a machlokes amongst the Rishonim. If his ban remains in force, b'makim mitzvah, let's follow the shitta that it does not. The first shitta in the Shulchan Aruch, that it does not stand. And so therefore there is no ban for you to do a mitzvah. Okay, what's the mitzvah? Pruravu. all of this rests on a unique argument that's being presented and being presented here for the first time, that the child born to you is not your child. It counts as your brother's child. So that means you're not doing the mitzvah of peruvu. And we have a shitta that says that in order to do the mitzvah, you're allowed to take a second wife. And so therefore, this is the argument, this is the logic that Marco is presenting for why, even though you accept the ban against polygamy, but you know something? You can go ahead and you could take another wife in order to do your mitzvah of peruvu, because the children born from this yavama arrangement aren't even your children. Okay, does it say this anywhere? So the emes is, it does not say this anywhere. We don't have any source amongst the Rishonim who make this argument that a yavam who has children with his yavama, they don't count as his children, and it doesn't count as your mitzvah of peruvu. We don't have such a source in any of the Rishonim, or put it this way, none of the sources that I saw, at least that before the period of Marco, meaning before the 1530s, there is no source that says such a thing. So he is making a chiddush over here, but I want to show that it's somewhat grounded in reality by showing that there is this idea that polygamy is allowed in order to do the mitzvah of peruvu. His chiddush here was saying that the children that are going to be born from this first union, that have been born, that will be born, don't count for your peruvu. That is his chiddush. In fact, there's a text from about 100 years later from Menashe ben Yisrael, who wrote a sefer, Nishmas Chaim. It's a spiritual sefer. It talks a lot about neshamas and gulgulim. The Menashe ben Yisrael, incidentally, is actually related to the whole topic of England, and that's because he plays a central role in attempting and to some degree succeeding or not succeeding, but that's a story for another time, to get the Jews readmitted into England in the 1600s. Anyway, in his sefer Nishmas Chaim, in Maimer Dalid, he asks an interesting question. He says, what happens if there is a case of Yibum, and the Yavam together with the Yavama, Mazel Tov, they had one child. So he asks the following question. What happens if then the Yavam dies and the Yavama survives? There's only one child. The child, he says, it's his Havamina, not his Maskana, but he says the child is attributed to who? To the brother. So it turns out the Yavam himself died without children. So this lady now needs to do Yibum with another brother for another, because the original Yavam number one, died without children because the one child they had is attributed to the first brother that died. This is the question that he asks. What does he answer? He says it's a narisha question, because this idea that the child doesn't belong to the Yavam is wrong. Yes, the pasuk says, "Vayeda Oinan ki lo yiazara." Oinan knew that the child wouldn't be his; it would be his brother heir. But that was a mistake. Ze'eno yames. And here he goes and explains the Inyan al pi Kabbalah. He says you can't even say the child belongs to the first brother, because according to Kabbalah, the soul of the dead brother comes into the child. So it's almost like it's not that there is no dead brother. You can't say that he belongs to himself. So the dead brother came into the child. The child is beferish, attributed to the Yavam. It's his child, and in that sense, he says, is both your brother and your child all tied up into one. Oinan made a mistake by thinking it wouldn't be his child, but really it is your child. Obviously it's a schus for the deceased brother, but it's even more than a schus, because it's almost like you're bringing him back to life, but then you are his father, and so therefore he says it's 100% your son. But again, the main point is, I don't want to bring so much a proof from Menashe ben Yisrael. I think it's an interesting text. The main point here is there are no sources in the Gemara down till, and I tell you when that changes, down to our period right now, there are no sources that say that when a Yavam marries a Yavama, it's not the Yavam's child. It doesn't say that anywhere. And so if so, to make that stretch and to say that therefore you can marry another woman to have your own children, that's something that does not have precedent and is taka chiddush, and I don't think that is grounded in true halacha. Now, I want to do a parenthesis here. And that's because something very odd happens. Something very, very odd happens. As far as I can tell, I see the beginnings of this in the 1700s. And it starts a conversation that in a sense really continues to this day. It's a conversation that begins among Sephardic Rabbanim. The first one is Rabbi Yaakov ibn Tzur. He was a Rav in Morocco. He was born in 1673. And it's picked up by other Sephardic Gedolim throughout the 1700s, 1800s, and even the 1900s. And it's the polar opposite of everything we were speaking about. Or in other words, it's going to reflect, oddly enough, it's going to reflect Marco's views presented to King Henry. So the text is Rabbi Yaakov ibn Tzur is a sefer. It's named Mishpat Utztaka B'Yaakov. And in Siman Shin Lamed Beis, he discusses the following case. He's a Sephardi. And the Sephardim, they did not accept the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom. However, it's not like they had polygamy left and right, because what would often happen is that when a woman would get engaged, she would make her chassan promise, a shvua, that he will not marry another woman. And in fact, often case we can see these written into ksubos that survive. I will not marry another woman so long that you are alive. And in this way, they created their own version of Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, which was much more personalized. So the question was, you have a man who is single, and his brother dies without children, so Yibum needs to happen. So the girl's family says, no problem, we're all for the Yibum. We like the idea that a brother will take our daughter. However, please make the shvua. Please swear that you're going to take the Yavama in marriage, but that you will not marry another woman after her. Says Rabbi Yaakov ibn Tzur, and he doesn't say this as his own chiddush. He says that he saw this b'ksav of Chachamim Harishonim, but it doesn't tell us who these Chachamim Harishonim are. You cannot force the man to make this shvua. Why can't you force the man to make this shvua? Because when this man has children with this Yavama, heim lahakim zera la'achiv. And he says, the pasuk says, Vayeda, Oinon ki lo yiazar, it's not going to be his children. And Oinon knew it. And he's medayik in the pasuk. It doesn't say Vayachshoiv Oinon, and Oinon mistakenly thought. It says Vayeda Oinon, which means that Oinon knew, and it's true. Dahainu Yedia Amitis. Which means if he wants to make the shvua, he can make the shvua. But you can't force him to make the shvua because he has a right to say, I want to have my own children. And so therefore, yes, I'm taking this Yavama now, and all those children, they aren't attributed to me. I am going to have to take a second wife in order to have my own children. This, again, the first time we see anything of this sort is in the early 1700s. I don't know exactly when he wrote his sefer, but this is where he is writing this idea. And as you can tell, this reflects very, very closely what Marco was trying to tell King Henry, that although polygamy normally is not allowed, but in this case it's makom mitzvah, and because the children of the Yavama situation aren't going to be yours, so then yes, you could go and take another wife for the kiyum of the mitzvah. That's very similar to what's happening here in the text of Rabbi Yaakov ibn Tzur, which seems to be a turn from all of the precedent, because the precedent is silent. And you would have heard, if this were true, you would have heard from the Rambam, the Rif, the Rosh, the Shulchan Aruch, any of these earlier sources. We don't see any of that in the earlier sources, but we see it here. And then the conversation continues. There's a sefer called Simchas Yom Tov, written by Rabbi Yom Tov Al-Ghazi. He was a Rav in Eretz Yisrael. He was born in the year 1727. And he says that he has a certain version of the Sifri, and this brings us to a complicated question of the proper text in the Sifri, and there's disagreements about the right way to read it or not. What's the right way to read it, which we can't get into, but the bottom line is he argues the following, that if you have a Yavam who has a child with a Yavama, that child is not the Yavam's Bechor. So again, Ruvain was married to his wife. He died without children. Shimon took the wife and had a child. That child is not Shimon's b'char for the inyan of Nachla, for the inyan of Yerusha. Pashat, a practical din of din imamanis, he does not inherit a double portion. Maybe he could inherit as a regular relative. Remember, he is related, but he's einoi b'char l'Nachla. This is what he says, and again, he finds it in a complicated passage of Sifri where there are different versions of this. And there are another of other Rabbanim during this period in time in the 1700s and 1800s who pick up on this. A lot of them vehemently disagree and say this is unacceptable, this is a major chiddush, where did this come from? It propped up in the last 150 years, we're having this type of discussion. But the reality is that there are some Rabbanim who are saying this. One of the great deniers of this chiddush was Rabbi Eliyahu Chazan. Rabbi Eliyahu Chazan passed away in 1908 in Egypt. For a time he was a chief rabbi in Egypt, and he writes as follows, summing up the situation. Not one of the major poiskim, Asher Beis Yisrael Nishnalim, that Jewish law relies on, lifsek din zeh, to paskin this. Namely, we don't find any primary source, important source, that says that the child of a yavam that he had with the yavama doesn't count for peruvu. We don't have any primary source to say that the child, a yavam and yavama, that child isn't going to inherit the double portion because it's not his father. We don't have that. And by the way, there are probably other nafkaminas for kibud of aim, etc. We don't find any of this. And so therefore, vadai deloi kaimalan hachi. This is not halacha. And if it were, then loy avashoskim in egdoyle amachabrim. We would have heard from the Rif, we would have heard from the Rambam, we would have heard from the Rosh, we would have heard from the Beis Yosef, but we didn't hear from any of them. And so the bottom line is he rejects it. But I need to be clear: there are some who accommodated this. I even saw a tshuva from one of the poskim who said that it's a suffix because you have voices on either side of this question, and so therefore, if it turns into a monetary dispute, you're going to end up having a moitzi mechaver all of a raya. So this is a conversation. But what I find fascinating about it is that Rabbi Leo Chazan is right. There is no one in the year 1530. There is no Jewish voice that says anything close to this, and it only pops up later. And in fact, the voices are against it. I showed you the text from Menashe ben Yisrael writing in the 1600s, clearly negating it. So that's pretty odd. Marco made a leap. At first glance, we're like, we see your foundation, but your leap is kind of unacceptable. But then as history moves on, in retrospect, his leap isn't so crazy after all, based on the sources. Well, either way, this was not going to work. And the reason it wasn't going to work is not for the reasons we're discussing here today. It's for a completely different reason. And that is the king was not going to take a second wife. Polygamy was out of the question for him. In this letter from Eustace Chapois to, remember, he is the ambassador in London who's reporting back to Charles V, who's on the continent in Europe. He writes as follows about this heter. He writes, which opinion the king has found so extravagant and absurd that he has openly declared to the Jew himself that this will not do. By the way, you should notice that Eustace Chapois insists on always calling Marco a Jew, although he converted. He again and again, in one place he says he says he converted, but I don't really trust him. Just goes to show that, you know, if you're going to oppose him, which is what he's doing, Eustace Chapois feels that Marco is on the other team, then part of that is also to say, and by the way, I don't even trust that he became truly one of us. I think that's a larger lesson in Jewish history, but that's not our topic right now. But anyway, Henry told him that he must devise some other means. You got to give me another heter of getting him out of the difficulty. For that he would never adopt, indeed would rather die than resort to such expedient. Meaning he's rather die than marry a second wife, as it would be an infamous and blamable act for him to have two wives at the same time. This is what Chapois understood Henry told Marco the Jew, and so he now has to go home, do more research, and come up with a second heter. It seems that this was his heter. His heter was the polygamy heter that we discussed till now, and all that travel and all of that time and effort coming from Italy to London was all invested in that. But it turns out that the king spits it out and is not interested in it, and he has to come up with a second approach to get Henry what he wants, which is to marry Anne Boleyn. So how is he going to do that? So again, we have another correspondence from March 1st, 1531. Eustace Chapois again writing to Emperor Charles V. Again, all these letters are printed in these summaries that were published in the 1870s in London in English. Anyway, so let's pick up the story and see what his second heter is. The Jew whom the king sent for has drawn out another vain and ill-founded heter as the former, propounding that it is allowed. So what's the argument? That it is allowable for a man to take to wife the widow of his brother. Yibum is allowed, provided he do it out of his own desire and will. It has to be beratzen, and with the direct intention of procuring descent to his brother. Line has to be with the kavana of giving children to his brother. In other words, to use our language, it has to be l'shem ha-mitzvah, without such marked intention. But if you don't have l'shem mitzvah, he maintains the marriage is forbidden by divine law. So then it's usher to do this yibum. If they did so marry, no generation could spring forth from them. They're not going to have children. If a yavam married a yavama shaloi lishma, they can't have children. And if they do have children, they won't last long. And as the male children begot by the king that Catherine had have not lived long, remember all those infant mortalities, the Jew argues and concludes that Henry must have married his brother's widow without the above express intention. So you can imagine, it's very interesting because you have Marco here looking at the king in the eye and saying that the act that you did, the marriage that you did in 1509 when you married the widow of your brother, it was shalai lishma. And how do I know it was shalai lishma? Because I see God punishing you by the fact that these children have not been surviving. That tells me you did it shalai lishma. And so therefore, consequently, that his marriage is illegitimate and invalid. What he's saying here is, Yibum Shaloi Lishma means the marriage is not valid. And so therefore, yes, this is an opinion that leads us to say that it should be annulled. And so this is a voice that Henry could indeed find useful to put at the Pope's doorstep. Again, we don't hear Marco's voice. We don't know exactly what he said. But I'd like to suggest that we can understand very well what he said by going into some of the halachic sources on this subject, because he's making an argument. I think we should break this down into 2 points. Argument number 1, he's saying it is very, very important that Yibum is supposed to happen with the right kavana. Number 2, if it didn't happen with the right kavana, the marriage is batal. So let's have a look at the sources that address this topic. So the Mishnah in B'chayris in Perek Aleph says as follows: Barishayna, in the beginning, shal yu mechavnen l'shem mitzvah, in earlier times, when the men were having the kavanah for the mitzvah, so in that reality, mitzvahs yibum kodemes l'mitzvahs chalitza, so then, as Pshuta Shomikra reads, yibum is preferred over chalitza. V'achshav, however, now, she'ein miskavnen l'shem mitzvah, now, however, that the men aren't having the kavanah for mitzvah, so we said, mitzvahs chalitza, kodemes l'mitzvahs yibum, now actually we prefer chalitza over yibum. So right away we actually see over here a voice that says, similar to what Marco said, that it's very important to have the proper intention. And in fact, so much so, if you're not having the proper intention, instead of doing yibum, you're supposed to be doing chalitza. Okay, but let's deepen our understanding of what's going on over here by turning to the Gemara in Yevamis, Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, where the Amoraim have a conversation. Says Rami Bar Chama in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, Chazru Loimar, the Tanoim actually later changed the view and to say that mitzvahs Yibum is actually kodemes l'mitzvahs chalitza. Actually, no, let's go back to say Yibum is preferred over chalitza. Frek the Gemara, Achshar Dare? What do you mean? Are you going to say that there was a time that men weren't having the proper kavanah, so we had a yeridas hadoros, but then we got better and we started having kavanah for the mitzvah, which is why now it snaps back on that the mitzvah of Yibum comes first? So the Gemara explains, no, that's not what's happening. We can't assume that the generations are getting better. So rather, what's happening here is as follows. There's an opinion of Abba Shol. And Abba Shol, there's a brayta that says, Abba Shol says, if a man marries, a Yava marries a Yavama because she's beautiful. He marries a Yavama because he wants to have the status of a married man. Maybe he needs it for work, for his business card, or whatever it is. For any other ulterior motive, other than the mitzvah of Yibum, Ki'ilu Pagea Be'erva. Abba Shol says it's mamish almost as if it's an Isser. The Rashba points out, not that it's mamish, it's Ki'ilu Pagea Be'erva. Remember, we're dealing here with a woman who is a Eishasach. And so there's only kind of one way that makes it a non-Eishasach, the mitzvah of Yibum. Okay, so then you need to have the kavanah for Yibum. Continues Abba Shol and says, "V'karev ani be'enai li is havlad mamzer." In fact, if they end up the yavam together with the yavam who got married for the wrong reasons have a child, v'karev ani be'enai. It's close, not that it's mamish, but it's close to being a mamzer. In other words, Abba Shol tells us kavana matters very, very much. Chachamim oimrim, kavana doesn't matter. Yavama yava yalea mikol makom. We don't care. What his kavanah is Yibum, and it is what it is. So basically what's happening here, the Gemara is saying that in the Mishnah, it reflects the view of Abba Shol. So therefore it says, once upon a time in the olden days, and that's why it's written in the Torah that way, Yibum is mentioned first and only as a b'diavad chalitza, because then they had l'shem shamayim. But now that we don't do l'shem shamayim, we're not doing l'shem the mitzvah, so therefore chalitza comes first. That Mishnah is only Abba Shol. Chazru loymar, that mitzvahs yibum is still koydel and mitzvahs chalitza, not because our kavana got better, but because they changed their mind. Not that we passing like Abba Shaul, we passing like the chachamim. You passing like the chachamim, then we don't care about the kavana. We don't care about the kavana. So then mitzvahs yibum comes first. And what happens here? The bottom line is we have a major debate in the sugya of the Gemara. Who is right? In a reality where we assume that we're not doing things lishma, at least very often. So who's right? Is the Chachamim right that Yibum, are the Chachamim right that Yibum takes precedence? Or is Abba Shaul right that mitzvahs that Chalitza is going to take precedence? This turned into a major machlokas amongst the Rishonim. The Torah brings down this machlokas in Even Ezer Siman Kuf Samachay, and he writes as follows: the Riv Paskins, like the Chachamim, Yibum takes precedence. We don't care about Kavana. The Rambam Paskins the same way. Yibum comes first. We don't care about the Kavana. So that's Spanish authorities, the Rif and the Rambam. In other words, the Sfardim. The Rabbeinu Tam Kasav, however, Rabbeinu Tam writes, says the Torah, the mitzvahs chalitza koidamis. No, I pass like Abba Shaul. Chalitza takes precedence. Even if both come and they say, please, we really want to do yibum, ain't shemelahem. The Bezdin doesn't let them do the yibum. Unless we know that they're having kavana l'shem mitzvah. So if we know for a fact that they're having kavana l'shem mitzvah, I don't know exactly how they would know, but one way that this comes up in some of the tshuvas where the Rabbanim did allow yibum is they say, we know this yid and he's a helik yid and he's a special yid and all that, so we know that he's mechavan l'shem mitzvah, so then we'll allow it to happen. But absent having clear and indisputable evidence that the mechavan l'shem mitzvah, we want the chalitza to come first. This was not a typical breakdown between Ashkenaz and Sfard. It's more complicated. The authorities that lived in Ashkenaz, in Germany proper, they actually sided with the Sfardim and said mitzvahs yibum koidemes. It's the Rabbanim in France, not all of them, but a number of the Rabbanim who lived in France, like Rabbeinu Tam, who actually held, like Abba Shaul, that mitzvahs chalitza is koidemes. And when we come back to earlier in this year, we spoke about Italy, that there was a case of Yibum that happened in Rome. And then we also said that Croke writes to Henry that he hears information that Yidden aren't doing Yibum anymore since the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Both are true. If you spoke to someone, a French Jew, a Jew who emigrated from France, and there were many who did live in Italy at this time who came from France, because remember the Jews were expelled from France a number of times during the 14th century. So if he would have spoken to a French Jew, it is very likely that the French Jew would have said that yes, once upon a time, Barishaina, we used to do Yibum, but now we do not do Yibum anymore, we do Chalitza. At the same time, first of all, the Sfardim would have allowed Yibum to happen. And in addition, remember, there's the local Italian community that had their own minhagim, and they also were not adamantly opposed to Yibum, following the view of the Chachamim, just like the Rif and the Rambam, that Yibum was able to happen. And so it's not a contradiction that on the one hand, it did happen in the 1530s in Rome, and at the same time, there's a report saying that Yibum does not happen anymore. And in fact, we know that it wasn't only one case in Rome in 1530 where there was Yibum. There's a number of tshuvas that are printed in the Pachad Yitzchak. This is a sefer from a later period in time, but he's quoting a number of tshuvas from the 16th century, and you see, Yibum is not an everyday experience, because the way the Rabbanim are writing is, these are tshuvas written in the 1570s, so they're writing, I remember as a kid, I saw 2 cases of Yibum, 3 cases of Yibum. So in other words, it happens time to time, and that's because, first of all, not a very common occurrence, but secondly, many Jews would not do it. And it really depended on which community within Italy we are talking about. Okay, so how does Marco want to use this? Clearly, Marco is leaning into these sources. And what he's saying is, Henry, you didn't have the right kavana. How does he know Henry didn't have kavana? That's a little bit of a bizarre thing, because he sees divine punishment from the children dying. Let's leave that aside. He came to a conclusion that this was not for the right kavana. It wasn't being done l'shem shamayim. Okay, now, if he's right, and remember, historically, actually, the Jewish community in England, if you want to make this argument, was very much associated with the community in France. That they corresponded with each other. Rabbeinu Tam actually had Talmidim who were there. Remember, the William the Conqueror, if I recall correctly, is coming from France. I may be off on the specific details over there, but it's definitely the case that the rulers in England at a time were coming from Normandy, if I recall correctly. So let's grant Marco the argument that the psak in England should be a French psak, which means we don't do yibum unless we know it's being done l'shem mitzvah. And let's grant that here we knew for sure it wasn't being, we didn't know that it's l'shem mitzvah, so therefore the yibum should not have happened. Okay, let's grant that specific argument. But here's a leap. What's the leap? The leap is, and what if yibum in such situations did happen? So he wants to argue it. Not only the yibum shouldn't happen, not only mitzvahs chalitza, koidemes, but if you went ahead and you did the yibum, so then it's like you didn't accomplish anything. You're not even married to her, so much so that it's garnished. Is there a source that says this? Well, the answer is yes and no. So first let me tell you why yes, and then I'll tell you why no. The Ramban disagrees with Abba Shaul. The Ramban in Yevamos Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis says Abba Shaul cannot be right. Kavana doesn't matter. We pass him like the Chachamim. And one way he expresses it, because he says, because if you follow Abba Shaul's logic, it would turn out that a yibum that happened with the wrong kavana is not a valid yibum. But that makes no sense. You hear? That makes no sense. So there is a view that says that if you take Abba Shaul seriously, then with the wrong kavana, there is no yibum. There is such a view. But that's Ramban not embracing it, but rejecting it, and therefore saying that's a reason not to accept Abba Shaul. So, is that support for Marco's position? That's a very difficult support to bring. What you would need to bring for support is someone who paskins like Rabbeinu Tam, who holds like, I embrace Abba Shaul, and we advocate chalitza, and we don't want to see yibum. Oh, and by the way, if yibum did happen, it's batal, it's nothing, it's nullified. If we find something like that, then that could be a voice of support for Marco. But guess what? There is no such a voice. There is no voice of someone who embraces Abba Shaul, who embraces Rabbeinu Tam, who says, I don't want to see the yibum, but then makes the next step and says, and if the yibum happens, is batal or muvutal? No. It's Ramban says that was an outcome of Abba Shaul's shitta. But remember, he rejects Abba Shaul's shitta. So that becomes a little bit of a difficult thing for this to become the precedent. Another idea that complicates this whole matter is that, if the whole time we're following this model, we're assuming we're treating Henry as an Ashkenazi Jew, as an Ashkenazi from France, in fact, in order, both in terms of Chen and Rabbeinu Gershom, and in terms of whether we prefer Yibum or over Chalitza. So fine, you want to say that he's an Ashkenazi, you want to say that he's a French psak, you want to say that it follows that, no problem. But you can't forget about, there's another party to this lawsuit here. And the other party to this lawsuit is Catherine. So if he's an Ashkenazi, well, she's a Sephardi. And it's not really so much of a joke because there actually were cases that came up. So where you have this type of mixed marriage. So look at Shilas Teshuvas Beis Yosef, Siman Beis. And you have there a case. It's dated to the year 1565, the 14th of Shvat, it's a Tuesday. You have a bezin that's convening, and on this bezin, none other than the Radvaz is one of the Rabbanim. And there is a case of a woman who's a Yavama. Her husband has passed away. However, she is an Ashkenazi. And the brother, meaning her husband, and now the Yavam, potential Yavam, is a Sephardi. She doesn't want to do Yibum. She prefers Chalitza. But the brother says, I prefer Yibum. Remember, he's a Sephardi, and in their tradition, Yibum was at that time considered to be preferable. So they come to Bezin, and the Bezin gives all the different reasons of why they should not do Yibum, why they should do Chalitza. And they said there are arba tainas gedolos va'atzumos, 4 arguments why Yibum should not happen. In this case, it should be Chalitza. The third argument is as follows. Hashlishis shehi Ashkenazis. V'chol hanoisa isha aldas anshe mekoyma hu koinsa. Very interesting. When you two brothers, the deceased one and the Yavam, when a marriage to a woman happens, it's aldas anshe mekoyma. And aldas anshe mekoyma v'yadua sha'ashkenazim emanichin liyaben klal v'ashkenazim, they don't accept Yibum. Kol sheken kishu nasoi. How much more so that you're already married? But that doesn't concern us. The main point over here is that the woman's origins need to be taken into consideration. So yes, you're saying Yibum koidem, but she's coming from a background that says Chalitza is koidem, and that cannot be ignored. And the Beis Yosef, he was not part of this Bezdin, but he was asked to endorse their psak, and he said indeed, this is a valid sniff. Not that it stands alone, but it's a valid sniff why in this case the Bezdin was supposed to do everything in their hands to get this man to do chalitza. And so therefore, remember, Marco wants to, he makes a big deal out of intentions. And he thinks intentions matter very much. Well, that's following Abba Shaul, which the French Rabbanim do, but that's only valid from one perspective. It's not valid from the Sephardi perspective, and that's relevant in this conversation as well. But the emes is that there's a more important point, I think, over here that really pulls the rug out from under the entire argument. And that is as follows. The Rambam in Hilchos Malachim tells us the dinim for a ben noyach, what are the arayas for a ben noyach? And the reality is that the list is not the same for a Jew and for a non-Jew. For a Jew, we have the whole listing of Parshas Achrei Mos of all the arayas that are asur. However, for a non-Jew, he says it's only sheish arayas asuras habnei noyach, and he gives a list of the 6. And guess what? A sister-in-law is not on the list. Eshes ish is. So while one's brother is married to a wife, obviously it would be wrong for the brother-in-law to have relations with this married woman. But once the brother dies, if Ruvain dies, and they're bnei noyach, Shimon is allowed to marry the wife without any qualms, no problem whatsoever. There is no erva over here. And so therefore that really pulls the rug out from the entire argument was that it was wrong. And so much was, Yibum made it right? No, for whatever reason, we'll push away Yibum, and so what we remain with is that it's wrong. Well, guess what? That base of it's wrong because it's a sister-in-law doesn't apply. According to the Rambam in Perek Tes Hilchos Malachim, the Ravid does not disagree with this. There is a passage, the Kesef Mishnah over there wonders, says that if you learn the Gemara, and I didn't go too far into the sugya, you could come out with a different conclusion. You could say that maybe all the arayas that are asur on a Jew are also asur for a non-Jew. You could say that, but the bottom line is the Rambam didn't. And without having strong voices disagreeing with this Rambam, I think it becomes very, very difficult to make this argument. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. So in order for Marco's argument to work right now, what we need to do is we need to ignore this Rambam. And we need to assume that there could be an isser to a sister-in-law after the brother passes away. We need to do that. Then, on top of that, we need to say, we pass on like Abba Shaul, that without the right intentions, not only you shouldn't do Yibum, but that if you did Yibum, it's batal. The whole act is batal, which, as I said, we don't really find any sources for it, besides for that Ramban, which, as I explained before, isn't really a good source. And this is essentially the argument that Marco Raphael made for the king. But Poil, what's the end of the story? It became clear at a certain point that no matter how many documents and how many papers from Jews or non-Jews they're going to bring to the Pope is never going to annul this marriage. And once that became clear, rather than that being the strategy of trying to collect these documents to bring to the Pope, instead the strategy shifted. And what happened is that Henry decided, why should I be subservient to Rome? And he came up with this idea that Ein al Gabav, there's no one above him, and that he should have the right to annul his own marriage, essentially, because and this essentially led to the breaking off of England from the Catholicism and the founding of the Anglican Church with their own system of bishops and theologians, etc. And eventually he did exactly that, and they made a commission of local English Christian leaders, and those leaders did what the Pope would not have done, and that is they annulled his marriage to Catherine, and very soon thereafter he married Anne Boleyn. I believe she was already pregnant at the time, and in this way the story of Henry and his wives continued, and he indeed got his wish. Catherine remained for the rest of her life in England as the ex-queen, kind of in exile, and Anne Boleyn was taken as the queen. Anne Boleyn is not the end of the story. A few years thereafter, Henry has her tried for treason and for other crimes, and she is sentenced to death and decapitated, and he goes on to take a third queen, and then a fourth queen, and then a fifth queen, and then a sixth queen. But all of those stories are beyond the scope of today's presentation. So in sum, was this entire effort a waste of time by turning to the Jews, if this is what the end of the story was? was. So it kind of depends. If the reason he wanted Jewish perspectives was to convince the Pope, then indeed all of this was a waste of time because he didn't end up convincing the Pope of anything. But if soliciting these Jewish views somehow helped him and his local bishops and priests say, you know something, there's enough here for us to annul the marriage, then it turns out that it probably wasn't a waste of time. And I want to conclude with the following. You know, Jews we do have the mandate to have a hashpah on the nations of the world. And that is most prominently expressed through the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, which include laws of Gila Arayos. So the idea of a non-Jew asking a Jew what is permitted in terms of relationships, that's a very, very good thing. That's an important thing. That's something that's supposed to be happening. That's a communication that we desire. However, every good and holy idea has a corruption of it, and I think that's what we're seeing over here, because Henry is turning to the Jews. He does want to hear what rabbis have to say, as we saw throughout this presentation, but it's not to hear what's right and what's wrong. It's not to hear an authentic Jewish voice. The dart has already been thrown, and now it's a question of putting the bullseye around the dot. He's looking for his specific answer. And so in a way, yes, there's something beautiful here, but it's used in a very wrong way. And what we want to see in this world is where Jews are consulted on these issues and on these matters, not in a way where we're being used for political agendas, but where our voice is actually being sought, and we're ready to offer that voice in a way of having a real effect on the morality of society. And sometimes it's difficult to tell whether a certain interaction, I don't want to go into specifics, but is a specific interaction, is that the Jew having a positive influence on the non-Jewish community, or is the Jew actually being used as a stooge for some particular political agenda? And that's something that we need to be careful about. And eventually, when we do have that hashpah, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, on the nations of the world, that is a sign that we're headed in the right direction in terms of taking what is perhaps known as the Holy Roman Empire, the Roimi, the Galus of this world, and transforming it all into the Holy Divine Empire.